This is part 2 of talking with Bonnie Badenoch near Santa Fe, New Mexico, in the beautiful hills of Santa Fe near. Where are we near?
Well, we're actually in Santa Fe.
Oh,
we're just
are we?
in the hills above Santa Fe.
Oh, okay, hills above Santa Fe.
Yes.
I wanted to ask again about the notion of, if you continue to pay attention to the story, if you continue to tell it, that it's going to deepen the neurons, which is not necessarily a positive thing. Can you speak to that? Do you understand what I'm asking? Yeah.
Yeah. So this brings up the issue of window of tolerance.
Uh-huh.
That if we've had some traumatic experience and it's not resolved, and it's one of those caught memories that we have in there, that as we tell the story and we activate those right hemisphere visceral circuits, if we just keep doing that without receiving the care and the comfort that we need in that moment, yes, it can, and especially if we get really upset, which the window of tolerance is the intensity of emotion that we can hold and still stay in contact with another human being, that we can and allow them to be with us. We have here this
dog.
Is Santo, who is our regulator. He's a very regulating guy, aren't you? Yes, Santo. You're most welcome here. Oh, you're very warm. You're very toasty. Yes. And so if a person gets so upset that they shoot way outside their window of tolerance and can't be comforted in that moment, then what happens is, yes, what we're doing is further ingraining that upset in the person because they've just re-experienced it again. But if instead you come up to that edge of that window of tolerance and the person who's with you is able to hold you there, then that's when that resolution can happen and the implicit impact reduces. So that's one half of it, but the other half is simply telling the left hemisphere story over and over again, telling the explicit memory over and over again. I don't know what good that does anyway. I mean, you're not in touch with the part of the memory that might be giving you trouble.
That's what, remember I asked you, because there's an Eberhard, what's it called? Eberhard seminar training, I don't know what it's called now. That was an exercise that they had you tell a painful memory over and over and over again. The theory being that eventually the energy around it would be diffused.
Well, and I don't know that it works that way, but I think you can tell a story over and over again in your left hemisphere, and eventually you just get bored with it.
Yeah, but it doesn't have anything to do with...
Not unless there's another person there who can receive you as this upset comes up. We're so interpersonally wired, and the way we get the best rewiring in the brain, in my opinion, and there are others who would disagree with this, I'm sure, is through that interpersonal contact where there is this warm other that meets it, and literally in that interpersonal connection rewires the brain pattern in a different way. Did
you happen to read that article that I sent you the link for in the New York Times about how some of the people... What did you think about the fact that the author said that some of the people were not served by the grief counselors that came in? What did you think?
Well, again, I always have so much trouble with anything that's one size fits all. And so when you go in, when they've had one of these big traumatic situations and they do, I think it's critical incident stress debriefing, everybody in that room is going to be in a different place in regard to the trauma. First of all, how it impacted them, second, in the moment. Second of all, how it impacted them in regard to their history, which is in their implicit memory. You know, and then in how they process. Some people process wonderfully by talking, and it is very relieving to make that connection. Other people need to be internal for a very long time before they're ready to do anything, you know, to share it or, you know, whatever. And if a person already has a traumatic history and then they're impacted by another trauma, often their whole system begins to shut down for a period of time because it's too much. So I think that the negative impacts aren't because of the, you know, anything but the goodwill of the people coming to do it, but again, the respect for individuality, and you don't know where another person is until you sit with them and ask them, how are you doing with this? Would you like to talk about it, and really help them sit with their body and sense what they need? And so to just come out and do these crash courses, I don't think is the best policy, but to follow up over a period of time and see what happens for these people, you know? Do they get depressed? Do they seem to have just, you know, been able to metabolize it and they're fine? Because if you have a really secure attachment as a child, you can handle a lot more trauma and are able to integrate it than if you've had a really upsetting childhood, because things come in and hit that childhood, and now you just have all of this stuff that's up and wandering around and begins to really impact how a person functions in the world. So I don't think you can do it that quickly.
Let me ask you a question about the person who does not have the opportunity to meet with a therapist such as yourself or someone who understands. Specifically, I'm asking about, I think it's James Pennebaker's work, where if you write about it, it can help to heal it. What do you think about the right to heal, or whatever it is, right, R-I-T-E?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well,
and also about the person who doesn't have a therapist. Do you have any
right.
recommendations?
Well, I think that any kind of process that allows us to touch these places and begin to release them can have some value. But boy, as I understand it and in my experience, the value of the other is pretty important.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a friend. It doesn't have to be a therapist, but it has to be somebody who can really be present and just listen and hold in a non-judgmental, comforting way what the person has to offer. So I think in a way when we're writing, it's like one part of our mind writing to another part of our mind,
Mm-hmm.
or allowing another part to express. And to some extent, I think that can be useful. But I just don't know that it does the whole job, especially when there's been severe trauma.
Okay.
Because somebody has to hold that window of tolerance for us. In order to go deep into the painful things that happened, we need another, if they've been really difficult, painful things, we need somebody to hold a window of tolerance for us that's bigger than our own.
Mm-hmm.
So that maybe I can only tolerate this much intensity, but if I'm with someone that can tolerate this much, then the experience will be held.
Mm-hmm.
And gradually my window of tolerance will also widen.
Okay.
And so that holding of the traumatic experience in calmness without judgment is
Pretty important.
pretty important.
What do you work with mediators sometimes, right? Do you train mediators sometimes?
I've never trained mediators.
Okay.
No, I've not had that experience.
What would you recommend? Do you know mediators are not therapists, and specifically not therapists? You know, mediation is not a therapy situation. It's a facilitation of resolving the conflict. Of course,
Right.
sometimes these implicit memories are certainly going to get in the way of the resolution. What would you recommend to a non-therapist, short of referring them out for therapy? You know, which sometimes it's so severe you have to do.
Right.
But what would you recommend to someone who is not trained as a therapist, but nevertheless is working with people in whom this may come up?
Well, I think any human being, pretty much, if they're willing to work on their own calmness and non-judgmentalness, can become a therapeutic presence. I'm not a big believer that, I mean, this may be heretical, but I don't know that all the training in the world necessarily creates that. And that's the healing factor, person to person, is a sense of kindness, a sense of non-judgment, and the capacity, the inner capacity, which relies on our own healthiness, to hold somebody else's experience with them.
Relies on our own healthiness. You know, that's a debated concept right now in the field of mediation, that there are people who say that if you can apply the skill, you can be really dysfunctional otherwise and still be a good facilitator or mediator.
And maybe you can be adequate, but in order for any of us, I think, to be truly present, whether it's as a parent, whether it's as a boss, whether it's as a mediator, whether it's, a therapist, whatever it is, in all of our relationships, in fact, the only thing I really talk about anymore when I go out and speak is cultivating our own mental health, cultivating our neural integration, cultivating a capacity to hold a lot of intensity with non-judgment, with kindness, and also with a real clear understanding about what's happening in the other person's brain. Because once you have that, it provides a stable foundation so that you can hold people pretty much no matter what's going on, because you can see what's happening. And it really takes the judgmentalness out of it to a much greater degree. So I think this kind of training would be good for anybody. I would like to see everyone in Congress have this kind of training.
You think?
Yeah, I think. Any place where we're talking any kind of human relatedness to produce some kind of good result, these are the core skills, and they depend on our health. So I am adamant about that. That one you're taking an awful lot to persuade me off the point.
Well, I won't, because I think that's critical too. I mean, you know, despite the fact that it's debated, you know where I come down, and it's you and I are in agreement there.
Exactly.
And I think that's a good place to end. I can't tell you how much I appreciate.
Well, thank you. I so appreciate it too.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Stephanie.
See you Saturday.